Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, August 31st, 2022. Man, time is flying this year. Anyways, on this episode, I am talking about the power of the purse strings and how federal funding inevitably leads to federal control. I'm going to start with some insight and warnings on this from John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution. Then I'm going to briefly mention a few examples of how it plays out in practice today, and I've got a bunch of reference links because I'm not going to get into many details there. But I want to focus primarily about how federal funds direct and eventually now control local emergency management response, something over the last 2+ years I think we've all felt the pains of. And even if it wasn't as bad by you as it was by me, and that's probably the case for most people, it's something that we really need to be warned about. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. I already said that. I want to say a quick hello, and I'm starting the whole show over. Anyways, hello, and thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. If you want to follow along with the original source documents and the articles that I'm going to mention in this episode, you'll find those in a blog post for this episode. I publish it about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I'm going to say hello to everyone out in the live chat and give people another minute or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream, especially those mainstream platforms. They can be a little slow on this stuff. But hi to Dixie Strong in Bama, Tim Martin, good to see you in Arizona, Haji in Michigan, Southeast Michigan, of course, Cheriton Farmer in Missouri, Senator DT in Elkhart, Indiana, Garrett Ashley in Atlanta, Liberty Revolutionary, good to see you, buddy, Clay Kent, Lisa Believe, Peter D. says, hey guys, hope all is well with liberty. Well, we're living under the largest government in the history of the world, but we are trying to set a foundation to build on that for the future. Well, to fight against that, to build on liberty. Dave Simmons, good to see you. Murray Ray in Michigan. In Colorado, there's Israel. Iowa, there's natural law. Dan Reed says fiscal slavery. Yo, got that right. Mac McClellan in Ruidoso. And Gunai in Missouri. Lawrence Smith in West Virginia. Stephen Smith. Christine Meyer, Dawn Smith says there's no sound at all. Hopefully you guys are getting something on this end. If anything, I am recording on this end, and it'll be working in the archives. But anyways, let's get right to this. I want to start out with John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution. Here he is writing in response to the hated Townsend Acts of 1767 in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. I want to pull this up on the screen here. He said, no free people ever existed, nor or can ever exist without keeping, to use a common but strong expression, the purse strings in their own hands. Again, no free people. You can't be a free people. There is no such thing. According to the man who wrote the most widely read documents on American liberty throughout the revolutionary period, we think of the revolution as a revolution in thought going all the way back to possibly 1761 or 1764 that culminated in the War of Secession, the War for Independence against the Empire. And he wrote the most widely read documents on American liberty. That is these Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, including this quote, until the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776. I'm going to wrap it up at the end of the show with Thomas Paine as well. Again, no free people ever existed or can ever exist without keeping, to use a common but strong expression, the purse strings in their own hands. I'm getting that the sound is good. Oh, Dawn says it sounds good on her end as well. Same with Liberty and Bean Davidson in Girardeau County, Missouri. I apologize if I get that wrong. Let's go back to John Dickinson. He continued with this. Where this is the case, where the people do have the purse strings in their own hand, they have a constitutional check upon the administration, which may thereby brought into order without violence. When the people control their own money, then they can keep their government in check without resorting to violence. That's the whole point of it. Because, as all the founders and old revolutionaries recognized, it doesn't matter how you set up a government. Dickinson, well, it does. I mean, obviously, the better that it's structured, the better that it is on paper, the more difficult it can be. But if the people believe in freedom, and you have even the best constitution on paper, John Dickinson himself, some years later in 1788, said a good constitution promotes but doesn't always produce a good administration, because he understood, like all the old founders and revolutionaries, that power was a corrupting influence, and human nature in and of itself is corrupt. I mean, we're flawed creatures. The best of us, and I'm not, are very flawed creatures. We are susceptible to doing bad things. And then you have sociopaths out there who think, well, doing bad things are for the good of everyone. Of course, we're going to rip you off. We're going to kill people for your own good type of thing. But he recognized that government, no matter what situation you were in, would always try to expand. And if the people believed in liberty, they're going to have a couple of options, and they don't want to have to resort to violence. People don't want to have to do that. That's why you want to keep the purse strings in the hands of the people, because you can check government. They can't do stuff without stealing from you in the first place. And then he goes on and he says, so in other words, with government funding comes government strings. But wait, there's more. He says, where such a power is not lodged in the people, and he put it in italics, he highlighted people, oppression proceeds uncontrolled in its career, till the governed, transported into rage, seek redress in the midst of blood and confusion. He certainly recognized what was on the way, what was coming, and what ended up happening. And unless the people gain control over the purse strings, they're going to have a revolutionary war. There's going to be violence, and that was a serious problem. Here's a similar take some years later. There's so many of these. Oh, and he went on. He says, if money be raised upon us by others without our consent for our defense, those who are the judges in levying it must also be the judges in applying it. So if they're taking the money from you and they're going to determine how they're going to spend it, and you have no say of whether or not they're going to take that money from you in the first place, let's go with the old taxation is theft theme. Maybe that fits here. I don't know if Dickinson would have agreed with that, but we can take his principles and apply it today. The people who take your money are also going to be in charge of how they apply it. And of course, that gives a serious problem. And he said, of consequence, the money said to be taken from us for our defense may be employed to our injury. And they're defending us in all kinds of ways. It's not just national defense and war, but certainly the founding generation recognized that large permanent military establishments, standing armies, were the bane of liberty, is how Elbridge Gerry put it, or the greatest danger to liberty, as James Madison put it, or something that always threatens the liberty of the people, as people like Samuel Adams and the great war hero Joseph Warren put it. We heard this over and over and over. But when they're defending you against all kinds of other things today, they have a war on blank. And you guys probably already know that every time they do a war on blank, whatever it may be, you end up with more of it. But when they say they're going to protect you, it really means they're going to rip you off and try to control you more and more and more. And here's a similar take from the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention some years later in 1788 in the debates over ratification of the Constitution. A guy named Amos Singletary, which I don't think many people have ever heard of. I only see these names as I read through this stuff over and over and over. I don't know much about him other than he was an anti-federalist. Dickinson was a federalist at the time of ratification, even though he was the primary author of the Articles of Confederation years earlier. But Mr. Singletary thought no more power could be given to a despot than to give up the purse strings of the people. Again, this is tying the purse strings to the people. If the people don't have control over their own money, then people who are despotic in their own nature, and those are the people who generally seek power, and we live under the largest government in history of the world, anyone who wants to be in charge of that thing, I don't trust any of them. If you want to run the biggest government in history, and you're not just talking about chopping every piece of it off, you're not good in my book. So if you're going to give them the power, a despot, this kind of power, you don't really have much worse. And we've seen this kind of thing play out over and over and over and over in modern times. With federal funding comes federal strings, and eventually you get federal control. Sometimes it starts out at things that seem kind of innocuous or for something good that you like in the current time. But eventually the people who have the power to do something you like today sooner or later, someone else is going to have that power, and they can do the opposite, or they can do even more. Now, I have recently been talking a lot about how federal funding is turning local peace officers into agents of a unconstitutional national police state. We should say unconstitutional federal taxation or unconstitutional federal funding leads to an unconstitutional national police state. They tend to focus a lot on the unconstitutional federal drug war, the unconstitutional federal gun control, and all kinds of other stuff. Here's how Mike Meharry put it in an article: federal funding is erasing the line between state and federal policing, which I will include as a link in the show notes for this episode. The federal government has fundamentally transformed state and local law enforcement agencies into a national police force, using funding to incentivize local cops to focus on federal law enforcement priorities. So if there's a Department of Justice grant program, they give them a bunch of money. Well, we want you to join these federal task forces to do these federal things while you're still getting paid to be local police officers. It's pretty nefarious stuff. The Department of Homeland Security, other federal agencies funnel billions of dollars, Mike writes, to local police departments through grant programs and equipment transfers. Of course, the feds tie virtually all the money to specific enforcement objectives, whether it's war on drugs, traffic safety, anti-terrorism, the right to keep and bear arms. We see this all over the place all the time. I did an episode on this just 9 days ago now. Top 4 ways the feds nationalize and militarize local police. They certainly also fund warrantless surveillance programs. I'm just mentioning these briefly, and I've got links to each one of them that will be included in the show notes. They used federal stimulus funds from the last couple of years of so-called emergencies to fund gun control programs. I did an episode on that in February. And then here, they actually forced helped push for sterilization of Native American women. I mean, this is absolutely insane, the type of stuff that federal money that they're stealing from you in the first place is funding. And if you guys are interested in a deep dive on this particular issue, it's pretty damning in my book. Mike Meharry did an article on this about a year ago. Lessons in Centralized Power: Federal Policy Facilitated Forced Sterilization of Native American Women. And here's how, just a brief overview. If you're interested in this, let me know in the comments or email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. There's a lot of stuff on this. In 1970, Congress passed the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act. Ooh, that sounds good. The law was intended to provide funding to low-income and uninsured families. Of course, we're out here to help the poor, right? But what do? They wanted to pay for family planning services. As it turns out, this federal funding helped facilitate the sterilization of as many as 25% of Native American women of childbearing age. The research is incredible. I will link to that article in the show notes. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. If you're interested in an episode on that, I probably have to do a little bit more reading on it to really get a grasp on it, but I could talk to Mike Meharry and get some insight on that as well. But it's interesting stuff. But what I really wanted to get into more today was this great new article that we published by Amy Lepore just on August 19th of this month, 2022, just in case you're listening in the future. How the feds have nationalized emergency management. Surprise, surprise. They've done it through federal grant programs. Here's how Amy starts. She said, direct funding for personnel and equipment, along with money to address minor inconveniences like snow removal. Think about that. Federal funding for snow removal programs make sure that federal agencies are involved in local response. And then we'll talk about this more. It has ingratiated FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security with local public safety personnel and local elected officials. Now, this has been going on for decades. And because things like snow removal, no one's really complaining about that. We've got worse problems to deal with, right? Why waste your time on that? And it just seems innocuous, so most people have no problem establishing the detestable precedent. Dickinson, when he urged people to refuse to comply with the Stamp Act in late 1765, he said, if you do, you establish the detestable precedent. Even if you thought the tax was tiny and no big deal. It wasn't something to risk your neck over. It was what the people who wanted to have chains around you really wished for. They ardently wished for, is how Dickinson put it. Because as soon as you allow them that single step, as Jefferson put it years later, you give them a boundless field of power. Anyways, going further, Amy writes, the results of this relationship are mostly bureaucratic and innocuous. However, in light of the increasingly authoritarian efforts connected to these crises, think the last couple of years, pandemic, gun violence as a public health issue supposedly, and disinformation they're worried about, it is important to discuss the potential downsides of heaping federal funds upon local crisis decision makers. Here's the three main ways that they get involved in this process. And this is something that I kind of had a gut instinct all along. You know, there wouldn't have been shutdowns, I think, even in places here, like here, right in the heart of it all, Los Angeles, California. I think in many places, they didn't have the financial capability to get away with what they were getting away with without the federal funding of I'm not just talking about the stimulus checks that ended up having parts of its program going for gun control surveillance, but I'm also talking about the decades-long funding for local health departments like the LA County Department of Public Health or the California Department of Public Health. And you can look up how much is getting funded by the feds in your own state. But three main ways that they get involved. This is how Amy put it. The federal government is wise in how it seeks to influence. It appears they have taken a three-pronged approach. They're not messing around. That doesn't mean wise as in good, but they're really smart, and they've done, if you love this kind of stuff, they've done a really good job at getting ingrained in these type of local policy positions. One, they fund local emergency management and homeland security programs. And of course, a lot of it started out it started out years ago, and then it expanded when the Department of Homeland Security came after 9/11. Terrorism. We have to gear up localities to be able to deal with this stuff. And that makes you think, well, they certainly do what James Madison told us was going to happen. He said, perhaps, and I'm just paraphrasing this because it popped into my head, perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged against provisions of danger, real or pretended, the tinfoil hat wearing Madison, from abroad. So they fund local emergency management and homeland security programs in such a way that makes the funding invaluable to local areas and renders programs permanent. Now, she links to a long research paper that she did on this in 2015 or so as well. It's really detailed stuff that I encourage you to read. If you want to geek out on this, it's really good info. 2, expand the notion of emergencies, right? Now everything is an emergency. Somehow there's an emergency clause in all the constitutions on the state level and on the federal level. Oh, your right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed unless the government thinks it's an emergency, right? I mean, this is absolutely nuts that people go along with that. And I think, just as a quick aside, the real problem is the people go along with it. We are surrounded by tyrants, individual tyrants, who absolutely love controlling the lives of other people through government. Anyway, so they expand the notion of emergencies and the role of emergency management such that this subset of events and people become synonymous with dollars and influence. And then 3, they curate training and professional standards. They have nationwide professional standards for emergency responders or public health officials, people in leadership roles. And so they build and fund these programs that create these standards so they can put them to their own. It influences who will be selected for these positions. And if you just think of how much influence then the feds probably had over the last 18 months and how much influence they're having going forward on local policy. Again, now, if it isn't as bad in your area as it is here in Los Angeles, 20 years ago here in Los Angeles, it was bad, but not as bad as it is today. It just keeps getting worse. So in an area that is less bad on this type of stuff, they still have the federal funding programs. So eventually, if you don't withdraw from those programs, you don't get out from under the thumbs, you don't get control over the purse strings, eventually something comes along at some point where the federal funding turns into federal control. So this is how Amy puts it. Through the grant-making process, local governments lose all autonomy in the management of emergencies. And on almost every single issue. See, there isn't an emergency power clause delegated to the federal government in the Constitution. It doesn't exist. So if there's going to be an emergency, it's up to the people of each area, each state, and in many cases, it's probably even better to have it in each locality to make their own determination of what they think is an emergency. And that way, people learn how to respond, learn what works, what doesn't, what they like, what they don't like much better when you have one-size-fits-all solutions or moving in that direction, which is certainly, I think we're in the moving in that direction at a pretty fast pace. And I think it will only get worse until people change their approach. But the whole idea of federalism, of decentralization, is it allows a market response. And when you one-size-fits-all it through taxation, through federal grant programs, you don't have the benefits of that. But that's another episode. Anyways, the federal government, Amy writes, now funds an approach to emergency management that positions agents of the state locally who maintain some degree of reliance on the federal government. By paying local salaries. I mean, who are you going to be loyal to? Oh, well, I mean, I only have this job because the federal government pays for, I don't know, 20% of our budget, and my job is that part of that budget or part of that 20%. Well, I better go along with how they like things, and I'm just going to parrot. And I shouldn't use parrot as a negative because I have a couple that are just maybe 15 feet away from me and they'll get mad. But if I'm just going to repeat everything that they say and do everything that they want me to do, or they're going to find somebody else who fits that national standard that they funded in the first place. So by paying local salaries for people that are in local decision-making and enforcement roles, you're thinking about the power of the purse and the power of the sword, which I wasn't really going to get into today, but everyone from Patrick Henry, across the spectrum, the political spectrum at the time of the founding, at the time of ratification, they warned against putting the power of the purse and the sword in the same hands because, as Henry put it, this would be the definition of a despotism. Anyways, by paying local salaries for people that are in decision-making and enforcement roles, the federal government has increased the likelihood that local personnel will serve its purposes. She wrote about this in 2015, warning about it, and she reached out to us and said, hey, I think this is really appropriate in light of all the things that we've been seeing the last couple of years to submit an article that gives an overview of this process. Those 3 steps are really huge. And when I think about it, it really strikes me when I think about the idea of snow removal. Because one of the things that just as a quick story on the side, one of the things that we talked about when we were trying to use this type of process in reverse, and we still are today, it just doesn't get much grassroots support lately, to turn off local and state level resources to NSA warrantless surveillance, which is redundant. You could turn off electricity to make sure that their data centers don't run. You can turn off water that's provided by a local political subdivision or state level subdivision because then they can't cool their supercomputers at those data centers. But also we talked about for a number of years things like trash removal, snow removal, etc. If you stop providing these services, it just makes things more difficult for them. And that's what they do to us. They pay for it. So if you don't go along with what they want to do, they tie those funds to stuff that people think are necessary or just the basics, and then they're seen as the good guys. Anyways, so these emergencies, the last 2+ years, we've seen a lot of local people serving their purposes. For example, here, the California Department of Public Health. I live in California. You might as well hear about how bad things can be. And they actually go through their funding here. They said historically, the vast majority of funding support for the California Department of Public Health, CDPH, has come from, think of what the order of this is, federal and state special funds. The vast majority comes from the feds and special funds from the states, and I would not be surprised. This is just my gut instinct. I don't know the details of it, but if someone who really understood this, maybe Amy Lepore knows this better than I do, I would think she does, this is kind of an expertise of hers, were to dig into this type of thing, you'd probably find that a lot of those state special funds were actually federal funds or federal grants as well that were tied to the state to provide those grants to locals. but then it somehow is seen as a state program. But really, a lot of the funding for the State Department of Health comes from federal cash. For example, they say federal grants help fund health facility certification to receive, well, unconstitutional Medicare and Medicaid payments. They didn't say unconstitutional, just for those listening. They also fund prevention and response, including vaccination, including outbreaks of specific diseases such as Zika and, well, other ones that we know of. Here's LA County's annual proposed budget. They haven't gotten it completely. They actually brag on their budget page that it is the largest municipal budget in the country. Maybe it's in the world. I don't know. It's bigger, they say, specifically right at the top when you go to the website. It says it's bigger than that of Kansas, Montana, and Vermont combined. Side note, Sarah and I, we are working really hard to try to move out of the county, but we'll see how that goes out. It's difficult in these inflationary times. Anyway, so their annual budget is $38.5 billion. 34% of that goes to health. 24% goes to public protection. So the number one thing is probably the LA County public health budget. I'm not sure if that specific budget is the number one specifically, but overall health is 34%, so almost $13 billion. Where's the money come from? It's about equal between property taxes, service fees, state assistance, and federal assistance is on the lower end of this, down to 15%, but it's pretty significant. $6 billion direct to LA County, where the majority of it goes to health. And of course, LA County Public Health Department is a significant amount comes directly from federal grant programs, all of which are unconstitutional in the first place. Back to Amy. Anyways, she says this undoubtedly played a role in policy enforcement through the pandemic, but because the public is generally unaware that the local decision makers are often federally funded, it doesn't nearly get the press it deserves. Doesn't get nearly the press it deserves. I think it should be. Maybe that was editing on our part. But basically, I don't think really anybody is aware. They're not really paying attention to follow the money. They're not thinking about federal funding equals federal control. And a lot of people want even more centralized control. But that makes me think of Thomas Jefferson from a letter to Charles Yancey. He said, and this is a paraphrase, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be." So if we don't understand this nefarious connection, this control of the purse strings from the feds to locals and see how it plays out and it damages our lives, the way it's going to get worse because of all the inflation and the money printing to do all this stuff as well. You can't be free if you're ignorant of that stuff. Or here's George Nicholas in the Virginia Ratifying Convention of 1788. He said, "An enlightened people will never suffer what was established for their security to be perverted to an act of tyranny." I guess there's not a lot of enlightened people around these days. Here's how Amy put it. She said, "Many, if not most, local emergency manager salaries are funded by either DHS or FEMA grants. I would argue that both the DHS and FEMA are not authorized by the Constitution. I would then argue, of course, that all of their grants are not authorized by the Constitution. So the funding for these local emergency managers shouldn't even exist. And if they can't figure out how to pay for it locally, maybe the market can deal with this rather than government. But that's, well, at a minimum, she writes, we know that half of emergency managers, she had a study that she linked to earlier in the article, acknowledged in the 2015 study linked above that they were reliant upon this funding, specifically for personnel to respond locally. At half of them acknowledged this, that without federal funding, they don't have the personnel. Without the personnel, they can't implement all these lockdowns and stuff that they've been doing off and on for the last couple of years. And we shouldn't be surprised when they try to do it again. And when you get to the root cause of it, they've spent decades and decades and decades building this system of control. Here's how she put it. There's a bunch of admissions that came from that same study. To understand the depth and breadth to which federal dollars have crept in and usurped local control over emergency response, these are what the local emergency managers admit themselves. One, they admit that their organizations are dependent upon the federal government and that because of this dependence, their local government does not have sufficient autonomy to exercise sound decision-making. So even if they're in line with federal standards and got the job through that or get paid by it, they still, even in that case, they're saying we don't have much autonomy because we're so reliant on federal funding. And it doesn't take much in that scenario to threaten the federal funding might go away or just throw more at them, right? 2, they do not even seek to dissociate from federal influence. They're probably okay with it. They love centralized control. Only 3% of emergency managers report turning down federal funding despite acknowledging the above. So they acknowledge federal control, and only 3% of them will say, no, we better not do this. And then 3, an increase in federal grant dollars is, of course, associated with an increase in federal coercion. That's something we would recognize, but this is what, from the survey of like a bunch of the emergency managers around the country who are being funded by the feds, they're admitting this. They're okay with it. They like it. And if we don't get to the root cause of the problem, we shouldn't be surprised that in the years to come, when there's even a hint of something that someone might call an emergency, and they're calling everything an emergency these days, the response gets more and more centralized and uniform every single time. One of my favorite founders of late has been a guy named Tench Coxe, who wrote a lot, probably more than anyone, on the natural individual right to keep and bear arms, of self-defense. But here's how he talked about centralization or consolidation of power. He said the 13 United States were not intended to be, and really are not consolidated in such manner as to absorb or destroy the sovereignties of the several states. Sovereignty is final authority. So if the final authority is really through coercion or funding or whatever that they're taking from the people of those states in the first place, comes from the federal government, that is not sovereignty. The final authority is really being acted by the central government. And I know, and I mentioned I was going to wrap it up with Thomas Paine, and I know this isn't, the whole thing isn't going to appeal to everyone's sensibilities, but I think it's really important to think about. This is in the second paragraph of Common Sense, January 1776. When we suffer or are exposed to the same miseries by a government, which we might expect in a country without a government, obviously he wasn't an ANCAP, but our calamity is heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. Whether they're inflating the money and giving us an inflation tax, the hidden tax, or they're stealing it from us directly through force of violence, or they're getting us to comply with sending us our hard-earned income, then we are furnishing the means by which we suffer. That certainly has been in the forefront of a lot of people's minds more and more in recent years. I will probably take a little time and look through the chat later on today. Let me see if I have a couple of comments. Clay Kent is talking about government infiltration into local governments. The country has turned into an absurd and sick joke. It has turned into an empire not just around the globe, the largest in history, but also an empire over the 50 states who are supposed to be free and independent, but in a union for limited, delegated purposes. As James Madison told us in Federalist 45, the powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined, but they get involved in anything and everything. Just say no to federal funding, says Haji 1954. It doesn't happen very often. I'm actually kind of surprised that 3% of these emergency managers as of 2015, I'm sure that's different today, but who knows? They were at least 3%. 3%, where there's 3%ers out there. 3% is a starting point. Let's get it to 3.5% or 4%. The more that we encourage localities to say no to federal funding. I did an episode, I should have had this one handy, about how a few dozen small Texas towns were turning down this federal stimulus funding over the last couple of years because they didn't want the federal control. I didn't even think of how it was going to apply to local health departments and things like that. But I wonder how much impact that had as well. So yes, say no to federal funding. That's a tough sell to status at the local levels, no doubt about it. But we're seeing some places do that. And I think the smaller towns, the very small towns, are really the place where you can get that done. And then you get it done and you show how everyone's not dying in the street, and then you build on that. We got to start somewhere, as John Dickinson told us also in those letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, 1767, Concordia res parve crescant. It's on It's our motto. It's on our 110% 10th membership card for annual, lifetime, and 5-year members. It means small things grow great by Concord. The penman of the revolution was correct. Small things did grow great by Concord. The people have let things get out of control in a much bigger way once again. So small things can grow great by Concord once again today. Anyways, I will look back in the chat a little bit later today and tomorrow. If you please continue leaving those comments because it certainly helps out telling those algorithms to show us to more people. You can also email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Ed Hen says, I come late for the potatoes. We'll have to watch later. Don't forget, if you really like if you like the work that we're doing, you want to help us reach and teach more people about the Constitution and liberty and how to defend both when government refuses to do so, constantly, 24/7, 365. Nothing helps us get that job done more than the financial faith of our members. You can get one of those annual memberships, or you can join us for as little as $2 a month for an online monthly membership over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, thank you so much for being here. I will be off next week, Monday, but I'll be back on Friday at 9:30 a.m. like the regular time. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.